G'day and welcome back for another Space Engineers tutorial. Today we're going to be building a little ship that can take us all the way from this base up to space, hopefully do something useful up there, and then come all the way back down and hopefully land safely at our base. In order to get up to space, we're going to need thrusters. Now we have used atmospheric thrusters on our mining ship here. However, they're not going to get us to space. These only work within a planet's atmosphere. They don't even work within a pressurized box if you build one up in space. Only in a planet's atmosphere. So they're only going to get us up to maybe 6.5 kilometers if we're lucky. And we've got a lot further than that to go. So what are our other options? Well, we've got access to ion thrusters. Ion thrusters work very well in a vacuum, but down here on a planet with atmosphere, their efficiency is awful. They're terrible working on planets. But that's not the only thing that makes them not a great option for our first ship to get to space. We have a look here, they also require thruster components. And if we head over to our production window, we can see that thruster components require platinum. And we don't have access to platinum because platinum can only be found on moons and on asteroids, which is one of the reasons for us to go to space in the first place. So the other option we have, if we check in our progression tree, is hydrogen thrusters. Hydrogen thrusters are very powerful thrusters. They work in atmospheres, they work in space, they work well everywhere. Their limitation is that they require fuel. So we need to build fuel tanks to operate them. And we also need to build fuel tanks in order to even unlock them through the progression tree. That works out okay for us here because producing hydrogen fuel takes time. We need to process ice through an O2H2 generator to produce the hydrogen fuel that we can use for our thrusters. So it's kind of nice for us to have a hydrogen tank on our base that can be slowly getting filled up while we build our ship. So we're going to begin by building that tank. I'm going to add the tank to my hotbar. I'm going to build a little conveyor junction out here, connected to the base of this O2H2 generator here. And on top of this conveyor junction, we'll build our tank. There are two sizes of hydrogen tank we can build. There is the small one, and then there's the large one, which has both a vanilla and a DLC variant of it. We don't really need the large tank because even the small tank is going to be enough to completely fill our ship with hydrogen twice if it's full. So we'll start with the small hydrogen tank as it's going to be more than enough. As we've done previously, weld up what we've got in our inventory, then right click on it, go over to our conveyor port, middle mouse, try and grab what we've already made, and then shift middle mouse to get the assembler to build all those remaining components. Then with our tank built, we will have unlocked new blocks. And those new blocks are our hydrogen thrusters. Now that that's built, you can see that the amount of ice in our O2H2 generator is going down. If we go to our control panel and find our tank, you can see that it's slowly getting filled. The amount of ice we have at the moment is not going to be anywhere near enough to fill this tank, so we'll need to take our mining ship out a few times to collect ice. My preference is to just go out and collect some ice whenever I'm waiting for the assembler to build some components. Some of you might be wondering at this point, what's going to happen when I run out of ice in the O2H2 generator, because that's how we've been filling up our hydrogen bottles. Well, if we have a look in our control panel here and we start with the O2H2 generator, you can see down the bottom there's this section where we have this grayed out refill bottles button and auto refill checkbox. As long as this checkbox is filled, anytime you transfer a bottle into that inventory, it will automatically fill. In the case of the O2H2 generator, if there is any ice there. In the case of the hydrogen tank, that's not set by default, so we need to make sure it's set. So we're going to check auto refill, and we're going to find the inventory of our tank, and we can drag our hydrogen bottle across to there, and it will fill as long as the tank has enough hydrogen to fill it. So that's how we're going to fill our hydrogen bottles going forward. Let's get started on this ship. To begin with, we're going to want a place to connect it. So I'm going to begin with a connector. I'm going to place it on this conveyor here. We're going to set this up so that we can build a small connector that's attached to it. In order to get a small grid connector to hook up to this one, what we're going to need to do is build a pair of armor blocks, one underneath the connector and one just in front. And then we're going to want to place a small armor block in front to put our connector on top of. We want to make sure that this block, when we place it, is aligned with that connector. The way we're going to do that is we're going to press R to change grid size. By pressing R, the block keeps its same alignment when we change grid size. If I go back up to large grid and instead press 4, it will now align to my character's orientation. So depending on your use case, this might actually come in handy for you. So if we change back to large, press R, we can then drop an armor block there. Now, we can't place another block out here, and we kind of need it. So what we're going to do is place another 2 on top, grind out the one underneath, the small grid one, not the large grid one, and then on top of this, place our connector. And as you can see, that lines up almost perfectly. Hopefully, I've placed it close enough that when I get these computers, that it will be able to lock to that large connector. There we go. Magnet's already working. If I go into the control panel of this connector, I can then scroll down, find lock, and press that. This connector is now safely locked to the large grid, and as a bonus, when we build our battery on board our ship, it's going to be able to get charge from our base, which is very, very handy. Now that we've got our connector, we can start building our ship. One of the things I want to add to this is going to be a large cargo container. I want to use a large cargo container because I want something big enough that if we find some ores in space, we can actually bring a decent amount back with us. These large cargo containers have 6 cargo access ports, 3 of the large type and 3 of the small type, arranged like you can see here. What I want to do is make sure that mine are arranged so that the large ones go backwards, forwards, and down. That's going to help align to the other blocks we're going to add later to make sure everything is nicely piped up. Conveniently, this connector here is hooked up to my inventory system because it's locked onto a connector on my base. So I can just press middle mouse to add my cargo container to my build planner, shift middle mouse to put it all into production, and then wait for all that to be made. Once all the parts are made, let's make sure this lines up correctly to my connector. So I want it this way around. When we weld this up, we can make sure that it is correct. We can see on the connector side, there's a big yellow boundary there, which shows the big ports there, big port to the front, and big port down. So that's our cargo container. The next thing I want to add is a survival kit. The survival kit on this ship is optional, but I like the idea of having it in the event that something goes a little bit wrong while we're up in space. Like, I don't know, going splat into an asteroid. And then you have to respawn back at your base down here, and your ship's up in space, and you don't know where it is because you haven't got enough of broadcast range. You're too far away from the planet, you can't see it anymore. You lost your whole ship. But if you have the survival kit, you'll just respawn at it. As I think it makes the ship on the whole look a bit better if we add this, I'm going to add a conveyor frame. This is one of your options from the large conveyor blocks on small grid. It's going to extend that large cargo access port, so then we can get our survival kit, making sure its large one is aligned up properly, and we can weld both those blocks up. In this case, we can either use the standard cockpit or the flush cockpit. In this case, I'm going to use the flush cockpit, but both work perfectly because the ports that we're going to use are on both of them in the same place. So I'll place down the flush cockpit, get it welded up. The next thing I want to add is a battery. I'm going to add a large battery like this. I'm going to put it on the back of my survival kit here. The reason I want to add this now is the sooner you add the battery to your ship, the more power you get to build up in it from your wind turbines while you're doing the rest of the build, meaning that it's got more charge in it, ready to go when you want to launch. I'm going to place this against the back of the survival kit here, as far back as I can get it. So that's where it's going to go. There we go, battery on. To really make sure this is fully charged up when we're ready to go, I can also go into my control panel. And since I'm accessing it through the cargo container on this ship, if I search for battery, that specific battery is going to be this one, the one that shows up in white font. I can even rename this to make it easier to see later. And then I can select its charge mode and change it to recharge. It's now going to take battery power from my base and store it in there, which means it's going to recharge much more quickly, so it'll be fully charged by the time I'm done. Now we can get on to building the hydrogen part of this ship. We do need power on this ship, even though we're using hydrogen thrusters, because power is required for fuel to flow through conveyor systems. So we do need to make sure we've got that battery. I want to put a large hydrogen tank on. I want to make sure that we've got enough fuel to comfortably get to space and back, even if we don't do things with perfect efficiency. On a large hydrogen tank on small grid, we've got large ports on each end and small ports all the way around the middle. Fuel does not require a large port to pass through, so we can connect this to our large cargo container using the small port on the side. So if we rotate our hydrogen tank this way, making sure that the large ports are facing forward and backwards, we can attach it there. And that will allow fuel to pass through from this hydrogen tank, through these connectors, through the large cargo container, and into the hydrogen tank. We need to be very careful in this build to make sure that we are aligning these connectors as we go, because there are a lot of blocks that we're about to place that have different sizes on each side and even have different arrangements that mean we could misalign it. So if you're finding that some thrusters at the end of this aren't switching on, make sure all of the blocks are connected properly, as it's very easy to mess up. I still do it these days. The next couple of blocks are going to be an oxygen tank and an O2H2 generator. Although we're going to be using fuel that we've produced at our base, in the event that we do get a little carried away and we fly too far away from the planet and our fuel reserves are getting low, if we have an O2H2 generator, we can then find ice on an asteroid or on a moon and fill this up, albeit slowly, but we can fill this up and eventually limp our way back home. So it's a bit of a safety net thing. Similarly with the O2 tank, it's kind of handy to have to make sure that we don't run out of oxygen in our cockpit. Now we could place these in either order. So if we bring up the O2H2 generator from our G menu, we've got our oxygen tank under the same group as the hydrogen tanks. If we have a look at these two blocks in small grid, the O2H2 generator has a large port on one side and two small ports on the other, while the oxygen tank has two small ports on one side and a large port on the other. So they're the same. They are slightly different dimensions, but they have the same arrangement of ports. I think we are better off having the oxygen tank directly attached to our hydrogen tank, because if we do this, the hydrogen tank will allow us to pass an oxygen bottle from this small port, because we're directly accessing it, through to the oxygen tank to be able to fill up that bottle to then put it in our suit. If we weren't to do that, we would only be able to refill our suit's oxygen supply from the cockpit and not be able to refill any bottles. Whereas for the O2H2 generator, ice can pass through the small ports, fuel can pass through the small ports, so there's nothing we need to move into it to fill up. So we'll begin with our oxygen tank. I'm going to rotate it this way. Then I need to make sure that the O2H2 generator is rotated the same way. We can tell with this sort of block which way it's rotated by looking at the horizontal bars on the large port, because they align with the two small ports on the other side. So let's build up the oxygen tank to make sure we've got it arranged the same way. We've got the small ports horizontally, therefore we can grab our O2H2 generator, align our large port with its bars horizontally, and I know that they're going to connect. Later on, you can ditch a lot of these extra things, but I think at the start, I'd rather be over-prepared and prevent a lot of potential frustration. Now it's time for the hydrogen thrusters. So let's add those to our hotbar. G, search for hydrogen. We can add this little group here. We'll begin with the large hydrogen thrusters. We're going to need some steel plates. Let's grab that from our inventory. Large hydrogen thrusters have 4 ports around the side and 1 on the top or front or back, depending on which way you orientate it. I'm going to call it the top. And we're going to align that large port on the back of our hydrogen tank here, on the front of our oxygen tank here, and we're going to place 2 of them underneath. One just here, not connected to anything, and another just here on the bottom of the survival kit, also not connected to anything. And we're going to fix those connections shortly. You could easily place one underneath the cockpit and underneath this cargo container here, but I thought this might be a good opportunity for us to play around with some of the other conveyor types, and I think it looks a bit nicer, as well as lifting the thrusters up a bit higher onto the body of the ship. So I'll get these welded up. All right, with the thrusters welded up, you can see which ones are piped up, because they now get this little yellow flame on the front and back ones, which are connected, and these lifting ones are not. To connect these up, what I'm going to use is, on the bottom of the cockpit, a conveyor converter block. The conveyor converter block is a very useful block. It's got a large port on one side and then small ports on all the other sides. In this case, we're going to be utilizing that large port to convert to a port on the side that's going to hook up to our thruster. Making sure the large port is pointing upwards to connect to the cockpit. As long as you can see only small ports, you know you're okay. It can be either of the 2 remaining rotations. Doesn't matter which of those you choose to use. I'm going to do it this way because I kind of think it's going to look nicer later on. Between that and the thruster, just some straight conveyor tubes. And for this side, we're going to use the side port on one thruster to connect to the side port on another. Get these welded up, and then we should start seeing some flame coming out of these thrusters. And there we go. With that welded up, we've got fuel to all 4 of those thrusters. Now, because we're going to be going to space and there will be no gravity, we need to make sure we've got thrust in all 6 directions. So we've currently got 3 directions covered. We still need left, right, and down. And for these ones, I'm going to use small thrusters. You could use large thrusters as well, but I think small will be enough for our purposes here. I'm going to place one small one here and one small one here. And then same on the other side over here. Small one on the side of the connector. And a small one on the side of this thruster. Then for down, we're going to add one on top of this connector and one on top of this thruster. The particular positions of these don't really matter as long as they are pointing in the right direction and not pointing at any other blocks. You don't want to cook your other blocks on this grid. The important thing to remember when following ship designs like this one, it's not important how the blocks are arranged, as long as they're connected up by the conveyoring where they need to be, and as long as they're pointing in the right direction, you can rearrange this however you like. If you're not particularly fond of an asymmetrical design like this, you could make it as one long line and make it symmetrical, or if you wanted to make this symmetrical, you could potentially rotate this survival kit so that the screen is facing up, and then duplicate the hydrogen thrust section on the other side. You'll then need to do some extra conveyoring to hook up to the cockpit, but that's pretty manageable and could probably fit in the space where this conveyor frame's been used. For me, I kind of like a bit of asymmetry in my build, so I'm quite happy with it. We've got thrusters, we've got power, we've got a cockpit, we've got a fuel tank. We don't have much fuel in it yet, but we've got a fuel tank. The next thing that this needs in order to make it a functional ship, even if it's missing some other nice touches, is a gyroscope, because we need to be able to turn. I'm going to place the gyroscopes on top of this battery, and I'm going to use 2 of them because the cargo container may well make this thing very heavy if we fill it up with ore. And so I want to still be able to turn comfortably when it is that heavy. The exact number of gyroscopes you need for a ship is kind of up to personal preference. Some people like to have something that moves very, very, very easily, and myself, I like to have things feel like they've got a bit of weight to them, because it means I'm less likely to smash them into things. We've now got a fully functional ship, but it'd be nice to make it so this can do something useful when we get up to space. Part of that is going to be making it so that it can collect its own resources. So we're going to add a drill, and we're going to add an ore detector. So let's get those added on. I'm going to add the drill to the front of the ship, right here on the front of the cockpit. Weld it up. Then I'm going to add an ore detector, just like we did on our mining ship. I'm going to place this on the back just here. Another function that would be really nice for this ship is the ability to find it if we have to fly away to investigate something and we come back and we're like, uh-oh, where is it? Which is a lot easier to happen in space where we don't have the surface plane of the planet to help us identify where something was. So we're going to add an antenna. At the moment, we can't build an antenna. If we check the progression tree, we can see that what we need to build in order to unlock antennas is a beacon. I know that this drop pod has a beacon on it, so what I'm going to do is grind that down a little bit, weld it back up, making sure I grind down below the functional line, and you can see that by building beacon we have unlocked new blocks. The new block being the antenna, so let's grind this off, so we're not going to need it on there, and we'll pop it onto our new ship. Adding it to our hotbar, I'm going to place it here on the front of the tank. By default, the antenna's range is going to be 5 kilometers, so that's going to make it a lot easier for us to find this ship if we go walking about away from it. When we get to space, if we want to be able to scan an asteroid to see what it might contain, sometimes with a camera you can get a pretty good idea of what's in there. What I'm going to do is add a little block up here above my cockpit, then add the camera on the front. If you've got the DLC that allows it, you could also just put a top-mounted camera directly on there. But I'm going to stick with the standard blocks as much as possible, at least up until the point where we do a tutorial on designing and making things look pretty, because then the DLC is really nice. But otherwise you can do just fine without it. It would also be nice to have some lights on board this, so let's add some lighting, just in case we end up anywhere dark. I'm going to add one light on either side of the drill at the front here, and I'll add a couple toward the rear. One just under here, and I'll match that on this side. There's one other thing we want to add, but before we do that, let's have a look at how we have to get fuel onto this ship, because we want this tank to be full every time we undock. At the moment, all of my fuel is in this tank on the base, If we have a look inside, we can see that there is 57%, which means we've got more than enough to fill this tank once, since this tank has half the capacity of the one on the base. If we want to get fuel to move from that tank to this tank, we need to look at a function on the tanks called stockpile. We can change this to on or off. When stockpile is off, the fuel is available to be used by blocks like thrusters, hydrogen engines, or even to be taken by other tanks that have stockpile on. If we turn stockpile on, this tank is going to start filling, and the tank on the base is going to start emptying. While this is on stockpile, the thrusters cannot take fuel from it. We only want this to go onto stockpile until we disconnect from the base. As soon as we disconnect from the base, we want stockpile back off again. Now, because that's an extra step we need to consider every time we dock and undock our ship, we're going to use a block called an event controller. The event controller allows us to do certain actions when certain things happen. In this case, we're going to use the event controller to set up a sequence of actions that happens each time this connector locks or unlocks. I'm going to place this over here on the oxygen tank. Weld that up, and let's hop into the cockpit. I want to disconnect from the base. If I go to my G menu now and I search connector, I've no idea which connector it is. So instead, I'm going to go to my control panel with K, search for connector, find the one in the white font, and rename this to spaceship connector. And now when I go to my G menu, I can see spaceship connector and it's ready for me to grab it. We're going to select switch lock. In order to safely undock, I need to make sure that my battery is set to auto so that power can be delivered to the ship, including the fuel lines, and that my tank is not set to stockpile. Now we should be good. So if I undock now, I can fly the ship. And this is fully functional. It does go up a lot faster than it goes down, even in gravity, because obviously we've got much stronger thrusters lifting than we do pushing down. That's something to keep in mind when you're in space, is that when you try to push up, you're going to get a lot more work done than when you try to push down. So it may lead to a couple of head-scratching moments where you literally scratch your head or the top of the ship. Let's set up this event controller. What we want it to do is do things whenever we press that number 9 key on our hotbar to lock onto our base. So I'm going to go into my control panel, find the event controller, and I'm going to select the event of connector connected. I then need to select the correct connector. This is much easier to do when we're not docked onto the base, which is why I'm doing it this way. Add blocks. And now we can choose what actions happen. So the event is connector connected. If we select actions, we get shown this toolbar with 9 options and one spot here, one spot here. Connector connected will do this action when the connector locks and this action when the connector unlocks. So when it locks, what we want it to do is grab our tank and set stockpile on. When it unlocks, we want it to set stockpile off. And then we can press Ctrl 2, go to the next hotbar. For our batteries, we want it to recharge on and either recharge off or enable auto. It might also be nice to do a few extra things that are kind of nice to do when you dock to your base, such as turn your antenna off. So when we dock, let's turn off the antenna so we're not wasting power on an antenna that's not needed, and turn it on when we disconnect. We could do the same for our ore detector, turning it off and turning it back on. You can also right click and it will add to the next available spot. And if we like, we could also do the same to the oxygen tank that we've done to the hydrogen tank and set it to stockpile on and off. Previously, I mentioned that the hydrogen thrusters use a tiny amount of fuel while they're connected to the base. We could turn them off as well, but rather than doing them one block at a time, what we want to do is grab all of our hydrogen thrusters, shift select to get the group, and then give them a group. Space, ship, hydrogen, thrusters. Save. Make sure you click save, otherwise the group doesn't get made. I've done that so many times. Now we can go back to our event controller, select actions, find an empty hotbar, and we can select groups from the list up here, Pick this group, toggle block off, and toggle block on. So that's toggle block off when connected, on when disconnected. Now, that should be all set up. So when I go to the base, I line this up gently to the connector. Gently. Don't blow up, please. And when I press connect, the thrusters turn off, the antenna turns off, the tanks turn to stockpile, the battery turns to recharge. It's all nice. And similarly, when I disconnect, it all turns back on. This is a function that I think you will end up using quite a lot, but I will also be covering some of the more advanced topics with event controllers later on, but I thought this was a nice place for us to start and save us a lot of effort. The paint job, I'm going to do a similar job to what I did on our miner, adding the dark grey from the landing pod to the lower blocks, add a splash of blue to the battery, and maybe I'll add a little bit more later. Our ship is ready to fly, so let's check how well it does that. Since this is going to be a bit of a mining ship, I'd like to make sure I can return from space with the amount of thrust this has, even if the cargo is full. So what I'm going to do is add my drill to my hotbar. Not this one. I'm going to go to tool blocks and I'm going to add it from here. Right click, add to the hotbar. Then I can use left and right mouse to control it. I'm going to mine this rock here, since I need these resources anyway, until I am full. And then make sure that this thing can still fly and kind of get a bit of a feel for how well it flies when it's completely full. Okay, the drill is pretty much full, cockpit's full, large cargo container's full, even the connector and the survival kit are full. So, with all that on board, I can still fly. But as you can see, it's a bit of work to actually go up. So I'm going to need to make sure that I keep that in mind if I come back from space completely full. That's going to take me a long while to slow down if I let my ship get up to a high speed as I come back to the planet. Let's dock up and get all these resources out. We don't want to go to space with all those. And then, make sure we got a full fuel tank and head on out of here. I'll offload all the resources. I'm going to search for my cargo container on the base, and then I'm going to select show only inventories of the current ship on this side, and make sure that everything gets moved out. Double click to bring it across, and there we go. Everything's off the ship. Check the tank. It's 90.7% fuel. So I'm going to go collect some more ice and make sure that's full when we leave. Ah. And as you see the migration of the boulders down the hill, you can see why an event controller is quite handy for docking and undocking procedures. We could use an event controller on this mining ship to turn off the ejectors when it docks so that we don't throw away stone we collect with some other means. Oops. Okay, our tank is now full. Let's head on out of here. So we'll undock and start flying upwards. There are a few things to know with traveling to space in Space Engineers. It's not realistic, but there are some limitations that might get in the way. Like if I keep pushing, now that I've reached the speed limit of 100 meters a second, all the fuel and effort I am putting into keeping on moving at this point is completely wasted, so I should stop and use a different method. What we're going to do is go to our control panel, grab our 2 hydrogen thrusters for lift, which are the 2 ones that say up in our list. Make a little group of them, so we're going to call this spaceship up thrusters. Save that group. Then we can add that to our hotbar. Go to the group section of the list, find spaceship up thrusters, and I'm going to add increased thrust override and decreased thrust override to my hotbar. What the thrust overrides are going to allow us to do is to manually control the thrust output of these 2 lifting thrusters. When we use the thrust override for those 2 thrusters, the opposing thrusters, these 2, will not do anything. They will act as though we have our inertial dampeners off. So that's going to give us very fine control and allow us to use minimal fuel in order to get to space. And we've got nearly 40 kilometers to go straight up in order to get to space. And in Space Engineers, yes, you can go straight up. I like to have a little bit of altitude before I start using my overrides, just because you usually start dropping a little bit. As you can see here, my altitude is dropping fairly rapidly with the thrust override on its minimum. So I'm going to keep increasing that until we start to slow down, and keep increasing until the point where we turn around and start going back up. And then, when we get close to 100 meters a second, I'm going to reduce that override so that we stick at around 95 meters a second. We want to go up nearly at the speed limit, but not pushing past it, so that we're not wasting that fuel pushing up against that completely immovable 100 meters per second barrier. So I'm going to spend my time while we travel up, tapping 3 and tapping 4, trying to keep my speed relatively high. In order to get to space as quickly as possible, we also want to have our orientation set pretty close to level, because we're only using one direction of thrust. We want to make sure that it's all going in the right direction. And because we've got our dampeners on, any drift to one side or another will be compensated for by our other thrusters. If you have a look on the right-hand side of my hotbar, you can see A gravity and P gravity. A gravity is artificial gravity, so that's gravity that you generate by building gravity generators. P gravity is planetary gravity, and that's dropped from 1g down at the surface, now down to 0.22. It's now so low that if I drop my thrust override any further, it actually turns off, and we start slowing down using our down thrust. That's not ideal, that's not what I want. So there are a few ways we could deal with this. We can turn off those 2 thrusters. I can go into my control panel, I can find the down thrusters and I can turn them off. That works. I could turn off one of the lifting thrusters to halve the amount of effort they can put out so that I get finer control still. Or I can do the simple thing and I can just turn my inertial dampeners off. First, I'm going to accelerate myself back up to the speed that I was going so that we're going in the direction I want to go. When we reach top speed, I'm going to turn my dampeners off. And now when I turn my thrust overrides off, we're just going to coast. So now I can control this with the same controls without having turned anything off, and with the ease of being able to turn the dampeners back on just by pressing Z. Planetary gravity is now at 0.06. Shortly, it should drop to 0.05, and then shortly after that, it will drop to 0, as it always drops from 0.05 directly to 0 once you reach space. And we're at 40, almost 41 kilometers up. We go 0.05. 42 kilometers and we are in space. We're up here and we are surrounded by not much. There's an asteroid nearby. So I'm going to come to a halt now by pressing Z, turning on my inertial dampeners. Some of these asteroids will be slightly within the gravity well. So if we're going to go and have a look around for some resources, I'd prefer to go for ones a little bit further out that are going to allow me to scan them without using as much fuel. Now, to scan the asteroids, this is what the camera is meant to help us with. It's not going to be perfect, but it may end up being helpful. So let's add the camera to our hotbar. Press G, find the camera block, and select View. So if we go and look through the camera, we now have the ability to zoom in on things. So we can use the scroll wheel on our mouse, and we can get a bit of a better picture of what's going on. So if, for example, we look at this asteroid that is slightly within the gravity well, you can see this material here is different to the rest of the asteroid. That right there, I'm almost certain, is ice. So I could go over there and collect some of that to extend my fuel supply. Looking around the nearby asteroids, I haven't managed to spot any resources on any of them, so I'm just going to head over to this cluster here and see if I can find something when I get a bit closer. I'm going to accelerate up, then I'm going to turn my dampeners off and just coast. It is really important when you fly like this to not point at an asteroid or something that will destroy you when you do your acceleration. Make sure you point just off to the side into clear space so that if you don't slow down in time, you'll fly past instead of flying into what you're targeting. Let's get out of our camera view by pressing F, and let's come to a halt by pressing Z and turning our dampeners back on. And now we want to see if our ore detector can pick anything up. Make sure our ore detector is set to its full range, which it is, and we'll now fly closer to these asteroids and see if there's anything we can spot. Might use the camera a couple of times as well. See if there are any materials I can spot on the surface. Just because you can't spot any materials on the surface does not mean there are no materials to find. Many of them will be buried beneath the surface or in some of the little caves, like we can see in this asteroid here. Let's fly into the cave and see if we can spot anything. With how dark it is in here, you can see why it was important to add some lights onto our ship. And now, oh, I've spotted some ice. Let's collect some of that. That's going to extend our ability to fly around here for longer. Since we've got our O2H2 generator, it'll be able to convert the ice into fuel for our tank. Don't want to grab too much of it because I want to make sure I've got space in my inventory for other things later. And I've already only used 10%, so don't need to grab too much. But because I might want to come back here later, let's create a GPS. For GPS markers, we can type /GPS in chat and then give it a name, like ice. Or we can go to our GPS list here, click new from current position, and then rename it that way. But we have our ice marker, so I can always come back to this asteroid later if I need more ice. I also find it useful to mark asteroids that I've scanned, whether I've found resources or not, so that I know I don't need to go back to that one to scan it again. Two of the resources that we'd be looking for in space are uranium and platinum, because uranium cannot be found on anything but asteroids, and platinum can only be found on asteroids and on moons. We can see the Earth-like moon over here, and for the alien planet, it's Titan, which is that little orange dot there, or for Mars, that would be Europa, this frozen ice ball here. I'm quite a long way from the moon, so I'm probably not going to go there to try and get platinum. I think I'd be better off hoping that I find some in an asteroid somewhere. But to give myself the best shot, I could just gradually travel in the direction of the moon, searching asteroids as I go. More ice. So this asteroid cluster seems to be predominantly ice. So let's head off to another one and see what we find. Making sure we're pointing off to the side of the asteroid as we accelerate towards it. If your fuel is getting tight, the faster you go, the more fuel you use, because you have to use fuel to slow yourself back down. So if you're really struggling, just drift slowly if you think you can put up with it. But hopefully you get as lucky as I did and find ice on one of your first asteroids. While we're in space, there are a few different encounters you may come across. One of which is this cargo ship, this business shipment that I can see in front of me. This thing is neutral to me, which is why it's showing up white. If it's showing up red, it means it's an enemy. And certain types of enemies may actually spawn drones that come and attack you where you are. So you need to be mindful of that and just be ready to escape. If you see a space pirate mayday, that should hopefully pop up for me soon. There we go. That is usually a random encounter. Those don't tend to spawn drones, but may have guns that can kill you. So what I would do if I was going to investigate one of those because I was curious, is instead of going in my ship, which could then get destroyed, I'd hop out of my ship, open up my inventory of my cockpit by pressing I, and put my tools, probably my hydrogen bottle, maybe even my gun away, and fly in and have a look around. That way if I get killed, all that happens is I come back to my survival kit and all my stuff is still here. Hopefully you've had better luck than I have collecting materials up here, as I've only found ice, a little bit of iron, and this cobalt. Just for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to fill my ship up with the cobalt so that I've got a nice full load when I'm heading back to base, which is going to make it a little bit more interesting for me to safely land. I've got my home marker down there. If I turn off the other markers that are nearby, make it a bit easier. It's 50 kilometers away. I'm going to start heading that way. I'm going to aim a little bit up from where that is relative to gravity on the planet, because the gravity is going to start pulling me down when I get close. So if I am about here, I think that'll be about right. Get up to full speed with my dampeners off. And cruise on home. My altitude readout just dropped below 10 kilometers, so let's level off. Activate our inertial dampeners. And see how easy it is to hold a hover. It's not too bad. If I want to more efficiently fly home from here, because I've got a decent distance to cover, there is another little trick I can do that can be quite handy. So if I go to my control panel and find my back thruster, so that's this one. I can see that this is thruster 3, which is said to be backwards. So if I go to my G menu, you can see that thruster 3 does not have that back in it. So that's why we use the control panel to look these up first, so that I know which thruster it is that I need to toggle on and off. So I'm going to add that to my hotbar with a toggle on-off command. Now what I can do is turn off that reverse thruster, leave my dampeners on, and cruise forwards. When I want to come to a stop, I can just turn that thruster back on. I can even use gravity to accelerate, because that thruster is not going to stop me from accelerating in this direction. This is a good technique not just for hydrogen thrusters, but for ion and atmospheric as well. In the previous tutorials when we were searching for ores near our base, I made this home marker. If you happen to have forgotten to make a home marker and don't know exactly where your home is, and it is on a planet, you can often see it from a great distance by looking for the terrain deformations around the area. Spots such as this, and this can be seen at great distance. So if you head to those areas, you can at least get close to home and have a much higher chance of finding your base. So there we go. Docked. Returned safely from space. The last thing I wanted to add to this ship were these little landing legs and a few little detail pieces with some more blue splashes, because there wasn't really enough blue on this for it to feel right to me. I've also added a few little armored details as well as conveyor caps for a lot of the exposed conveyors, deliberately in different colors to the paint of the block that they're attached to. This version of the ship will be published to the workshop, as well as the symmetrical version with the tanks and thrusters on the other side, so you can have a look at that and see what inspiration you can take from them. If you've got any questions about the ship or about any of the things that I've shown today, let me know in the comments. If you've got any extra tips you'd like to share, please share them as well so that other people can, and myself, can potentially learn stuff. Next time we're going to be looking into making rovers, and then onward from that will be pistons, rotors, hinges, all sorts of fun stuff. So there's all that and plenty more to come, and I will see you then.